It's great to welcome to the program today Daniel Pink, who's the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including the latest, The Power of Regret, How Looking Forward Moves Us, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward, published last month. Daniel, it's great to have you on today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I read the book with great interest, and the book both confirms some of the intuition that we may have about regret, and also tells us that some of the intuitions we have about regret are very, very wrong. Maybe to start with, can you talk a little bit about when it comes to the idea of it's just better to live without regrets, which is a very general principle that a lot of people assume is just accurate. Can you talk a little bit about what aspects of that make sense and maybe where it falls short?
Well, it's a great way to frame the question. When we look, we have this idea that we should never look backward, and that we should, if we feel a spear of regret, we should essentially ignore that. And that is actually colossally wrong-headed advice. What the research tells us, what 50 years of science tells us, is that everybody has regrets. Regret is one of the most common emotions that human beings have. It is ubiquitous in the human condition. It is actually part of our cognitive machinery. And so to say that I don't look backward and I don't experience regret runs against the science. It's just simply not how human beings operate. And the truth of the matter is that everybody, regret makes us human. Nearly everybody experiences regret. I mean, literally, except for a very small number of people with certain kinds of disorders, everybody experiences regret. And if we use it right, it's actually useful to us. And this is the paradox of regret. This is sort of the puzzle of regret, which is that this emotion that makes us feel bad is ubiquitous in the human experience. So why? And the answer is because it helps us if we deal with it right. And we haven't been equipped to deal with regret properly. We've been taught in some ways to ignore it. When that fails, we end up getting captured by it. And what we should be doing is confronting our regrets.
Yeah, you talk in the book about, and this doesn't seem unique to feelings of regret, but in the book you talk about how if the thoughts of regret become intrusive, if they become sort of bottomless, if they become repetitive, that they end up having a sort of counterproductive impact, and
Absolutely.
it's not good. But that thinking about the regrets in particular ways and using them is actually something that is a positive thing. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between that? Because some people might say, well, if I'm not thinking about the regrets, then how can I use them to my advantage?
Well, so that's great. Another great question. So it's really, I think at a broader level, we haven't been taught how to deal with negative emotions. I think our religious traditions actually do a better job of equipping us to deal with negative emotions. I think secular society hasn't done a very good job. And so what happens is that some of us ignore negative emotions. We say, nope, not real, got to be positive, beep, 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 put our fingers in the ears. That's a bad idea. But because we haven't been equipped to deal with them, when they intrude, as you say, they can feel overwhelming. And so we have to ask ourselves this question about, like, what are these negative feelings for? They're not for ignoring, they're not for wallowing, they're for thinking about. And they're for thinking about, as you say, in a particular way. And there's a certain process by which we can think about our emotions and arrest that march toward rumination, arrest that march toward getting sucked into the vortex. And it's actually relatively simple. And when we do that, the evidence is overwhelming that reckoning with our regrets, leaning into our regrets in some ways, can help us become better negotiators, better strategists, better problem solvers, better parents, and find greater meaning in life.
You know, it's interesting that our interview is today, and yesterday it just so happened that during these Supreme Court confirmation hearings, particular sentences that the nominee, Judge Jackson, had assigned in the past were a topic of much discussion. And she was asked numerous times, do you regret the sentence you gave to this particular individual who went on to reoffend, or whatever the case may be? And one of the interesting things about that framework is that it's sort of like a results-based regret, where at
Yeah,
the time that a decision is made, you don't
good
have
point.
the information as to what subsequently happens. And the question was, based on what happened after you decided, do you regret what you did? And Daniel Kahneman has written about this, and in the context of it being sort of a cognitive limitation that we sometimes experience. Can you talk a little bit about results-oriented thoughts about regrets?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to legitimize those questions about sentencing as serious intellectual inquiries.
Agreed
They were
100%.
they were they were yeah. Uh, it was basically performative grandstanding and dog whistles.
Absolutely.
So leaving that aside for leaving that aside for a moment, and I know that you agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there. This is actually there are a couple ways at this. One of them is, as we were talking about before, that's a way to arrest the march toward rumination. That is, what you need to evaluate is the decision itself, not not what happened subsequently, because the decision itself is something you had control over. What happened subsequently is something you don't have control over. And so what I found in talking to people about their regrets is they were actually much less outcomist than I would have expected. That they were actually scrutinizing especially when it came to a certain kinds of regrets, they were much more willing to scrutinize the decision itself and were less wedded to the outcome. Now, all of us have that cognitive glitch, but what's important to understand with regret is that when we evaluate our choices and when we try to extract lessons from them, we should be evaluating the context of the decision, what we knew, what situation we were in, in some ways, who we were as a person at that moment. And because that's something we have control over, but the outcome itself, we don't always have control over. Although the outcome can give us clues.
You in the book you categorize regrets into sort of certain buckets, and in that context you did this world regret survey of 15,000 people in more than 100 countries. Can you talk about the categories of regret that seem to be the most impactful for people when they look back on their lives?
Yeah, I mean, what I found in collecting regrets from all over the world, as you mentioned, we're now up to over 19,000 regrets from 109 countries. It's unbelievable. And what I found, which is to my surprise, is that over and over again, people had the same core regrets. They regretted the same things. And these regrets are less about the domains of people's lives. They were less about, oh, I have a career regret, I have an education regret. I mean, superficially, that's what they were. But deep down, there were four things that people seem to regret the most. And I'll go through them very quickly. One of them are what I call foundation regrets. Foundation regrets are, if only I'd done the work. And these are regrets about small decisions people make about health, about finances, about education early in life that accumulate to, sometimes very grave consequences later on. So things about, especially things like not saving enough money, spending too much money, smoking, those kinds of things. The second one are boldness regrets, which are, if only I'd taken the chance. These are regrets people have where they're at a juncture in their life, they can play it safe, they can take the chance, and they don't take the chance, and they often regret it. And it's everything from traveling to speaking up to asking somebody out on a date to starting a business. And what's interesting about those, David, is that there were people who acted boldly and it didn't work out. And many of them said, I don't love that, but I'm cool with that because I took the chance. So that's a good example of what you were talking about before, people being, to my surprise, being less outcomist than I would have expected. Third category, if only I'd done the right thing. These are people who, again, are at a juncture. They can do the right thing. They can do the wrong thing. They do the wrong thing. They regret it. Bullying, marital infidelity, other kinds of cheating. And finally, our connection regrets, which are, if only I'd reached out, which are about relationships, not mostly romantic relationships, just the full spectrum of relationships we have in our lives, that if they come apart and we don't do anything about it, we end up regretting it. And what's amazing to me in this research is how universal these four regrets were. I mean, irrespective of, of nationality, especially, pretty much irrespective of gender, and to some extent, even irrespective of age.
Are there certain cultures or countries that just have a lower level of regret in your estimation?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I tried to get at that. I tried to get at that question I did another piece of so the World Regret Survey was a piece of qualitative research. That is, I was essentially collecting stories. I also did a piece of quantitative research, which was which essentially a giant opinion poll of the American population, the largest sampling of American attitudes about regret ever conducted, a pretty rigorous quantitative survey. And I tried to get at a version of that question that way by asking, say, about, say, belief in God. Does belief in God correlate with people's regrets? Zero correlation of any kind. I asked people, gave people three choices. Do you believe in God? Which of these best describes your belief? I believe in God. I don't believe in God. I'm not sure I believe in God. And zero correlation of any kind with with anything. I also asked people whether they believed that in general everything in life happened for a reason, and most people did. Yet most people also believe they had free will.
Hmm.
So other ways at that question about belief systems seem to indicate there wasn't much difference. I mean, I'm hesitant to say that. I'm very hesitant to say that definitively. My hunch right now is that that belief systems didn't matter all that much, and it could be because regret is so central to our literally to our brain function. That is, our brains don't have a nationality. Our behavior can have a nationality because it's our brains acting in a context, but the lump of cells in our head doesn't isn't an Indonesian isn't an Indonesian brain or a American brain or a Polish brain. It's just a brain, and
Yeah.
regret is central to
That
that
makes
human brain.
sense. I mean, at the same time, there are so many cultural ideas and memes like, FOMO, fear of missing out, YOLO, you only live once, that aren't the same across all countries. So it would be
Right.
interesting whether, do Brazilians tend to have fewer regrets than Danes versus Americans or that type of thing? And it sounds like we don't really have that data, at least at this point.
Not at all. I mean, in fact, if you're talking about the number of regrets, I have no idea because in my surveys, I asked people in the quantitative survey, I asked people to list one of their biggest regrets. In the qualitative survey, also, tell me about one big regret. I didn't ask, so there could be volume differences
Yeah.
that people in Slovenia have lots and lots of regrets, and people in Brazil have only one or two. And yet, when you look at the top regrets, the biggest regrets, there's commonality there.
The other thing that is interesting is whether, and I think you touched on this in the book a little bit, I think, and I've also read articles preparing for the interview, so now I'm not sure, but one of the things is, do more opportunities create an environment for having more regrets, whereas someone whose life felt like it provided fewer opportunities reduces the amount of regret that one might feel?
Yes, although opportunity is a little bit paradoxical. So let me give you a piece of data on that from the quantitative survey, the
Yeah.
American Regret Project, the big public opinion poll. What we found there was that people who had high levels of formal education, that is, they had degrees and advanced degrees,
Right.
those people, we know, which is a minority of Americans. I think it's something like 30% or so of Americans have a college degree, and an even smaller percentage of that have a so-called advanced degree. And what we found there is that those folks, the people with college degrees and advanced degrees especially, had more career regrets than other people, which is weird because, they. But it's so superficially weird. But it goes to exactly to your point, which is that the fact that they had more career opportunities might have given them a larger universe of career opportunities to regret.
Right.
Now, that said, thwarted opportunity can also be a source of regret. So opportunity sort of lives at the core of regret, but in a somewhat paradoxical way. Huge numbers of opportunities can lead to regret, but reduced opportunities can also lead to regret.
Last thing I want to touch on in terms of takeaways for one's own thinking and actions and sort of life. One principle that I got from the book, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, is in general, there seems to be more regret for things not done than for things done. Very, very broadly speaking. Is that true? And what other kind of general principles that one can apply do you think are important?
It is what you're saying is very true. I mean that's a claim that I can make with very little hesitation, based on the existing research and based on my own research. In the quantitative survey, that was a very, very clear finding, particularly when it comes to age. When we're younger, we tend to have equal regrets of action, things I did, and inaction, what I didn't do. As we age, overwhelmingly, it's regrets of inaction. And I think that the takeaway there is that in general in life, we should have a slight bias for action. That in some ways we're generally over-indexed on risk. And we're over indexed on feelings of awkwardness. So we think that asking somebody out on a date has a high level of risk when it actually doesn't. We think that reaching out to a friend who's drifted apart, it has high levels of awkwardness, but it really doesn't. We think, and this is a little bit closer to the line, but we sometimes over-index on how much risk it is to start a business. And so I think that a takeaway is that we should have in general in life, a bias for action, because action is also a way that it's also a way that we learn things. So I think sometimes we plan too much and act too little. We feel like in order to act, we have to plan out everything, when in fact, acting itself is a form of planning and understanding. So I think that's one big takeaway. The other big takeaway is, I think, in terms of how we reckon with our regrets, is that we should recognize that when we feel regret, it is utterly human. And that when we do that, we should treat ourselves with kindness rather than contempt. Recognize that it's part of the human condition. We should talk about our regrets and use language to make sense of our regrets. And we should explicitly stop and try to extract a lesson from those regrets. So if we do that, if we say, this is what I regret. It's totally normal. I'm going to treat myself with kindness. Let me try to make sense of it. Let me draw a lesson from it, and let me apply that lesson next time. Then it's an incredibly productive and even transformative emotion.
The book is The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. We've been speaking with the book's author, Daniel Pink. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.